Welcome back to A Mighty Fortress is Our Pod. Today's guests are Sarah Hinlicky Wilson and Paul R. Hinlicky, a father-daughter pairing of Lutheran theologians who co-host the Queen of the Sciences podcast. Before we begin today's interview, I have an exciting announcement. Official A Mighty Fortress is Our Pod merchandise is here. You can head to teepublic.com/user/mightyfortress to get t-shirts, hats, hoodies, and more. That's teepublic.com/user/mightyfortress. I am here with the co-hosts of the Queen of the Sciences podcast, Dr. Sarah Hinlicky Wilson, who is the pastor of Christ Lutheran Church in York, Pennsylvania, and Dr. Paul Hinlicky, who is the Distinguished Professor and Research Fellow of the Christ School of Theology at the Institute of Lutheran Theology. And they're both authors as well of several books. So thank you both for being here.
You're welcome.
Happy to be here.
And it might be relevant to mention that I am the daughter of Paul Hinlicky, and Paul Hinlicky is the father of Sarah Hinlicky Wilson.
Yes, and that also this is the first joint podcast we've done in terms of having multiple guests, so we're breaking new ground here. This is exciting. So, but yeah, since you taped that together, obviously makes sense that we discuss together. So I guess we normally begin these interviews of where your faith journey began. So I don't know if you both want to kind of simultaneously go through your stories, or if Paul, you want to go first, and then we can get into Sarah's story, or
Yes, age before beauty. I'll go first. Okay, I have been a Christian since I was baptized as an infant in Stamford, Connecticut, by my father, who was a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod pastor. And I was raised in the faith, and I was raised in the parsonage. So I got a double whammy, and I decided to pass that on to my daughter. And she had a parallel experience. And I would say also that I came of age in the turbulent 1960s and began to experience the great cultural changes that have since washed over American culture. And that created a great deal of anxiety about who we are and what we were about. And it was in that context that I was discovered by the Jesus movement of those days, and had a kind of renewal and intensification of my Christian faith. Fortunately, I discovered the work of Martin Luther in college and seminary, and some other good resources. I went to Bard College as a freshman, and I took a course where I read The Nature and Destiny of Man by Reinhold Niebuhr, which made a profound impact on me. And so my journey ever since in ministry and in life has been trying to follow out this resource of Reformation theology as both a critique of Christendom and a path forward in the ruins, a path forward in the ruins of Christendom. Okay, that's my story. Now my daughter's.
Well, it begins almost identically. Actually, until this very moment, I did not realize that Dad and I had been baptized by the exact same pastor, namely my grandfather and his dad. So there you go. We really did begin in the same font, as it were. And at the time, of course, my grandfather was still a Missouri Synod pastor, and it was in I don't know, maybe the church had already gone through the split off process. I was born at ground zero of that Lutheran schism of the 1970s.
X.
Yes.
Okay.
But I did grow up in the parsonage, and I had a very happy church experience growing up, which I later discovered is not necessarily the best preparation for being a pastor. You have a somewhat distorted view of the beloved community and what it means to become its leader. I think I had a more continuous experience. I don't remember any kind of radical, like, coming to faith or leaving the faith. it's been more of a gentle sine curve over time, or something like that. But like Dad, I was taken with Luther very early on. In fact, I recently wrote an essay for the journal Dad Edits Promissio, talking about how, in an unbearably ironic twist for a Lutheran theologian, I knew Luther far better than I knew the Bible for a substantial period of time. But when I did finally start paying better attention to the Bible, I realized that I actually did know a lot of the Bible because I knew a whole lot of Luther. So maybe a happy symbiosis after all. Um, Probably for me, the more seminal experience in shaping the person I would become is that I graduated a year early from high school, so Dad and Mom and my brother Will and I could move to Slovakia, which had just severed from the Czech part of the nation a few months before and had ceased to be communist only 4 years before that. And my family went there to be missionaries, so I spent my first year out of the US, and I was bitten by the bug both for travel and mission work. So in my adulthood, after getting my degrees, I lived for 8 years in France working at the Institute for Ecumenical Research, which is an affiliate of the Lutheran World Federation, specializing in Lutheran Orthodox and Lutheran Pentecostal dialogue. And then later in Japan, where my husband Andrew served as a missionary professor at Japan Lutheran College and Theological Seminary, and I at the English Ministry of Tokyo Lutheran Church, which is what we did until we ended up in York, Pennsylvania, which we are now calling our third foreign country.
Very cool. So thank you for both of you for that summary. Um, you both talked a lot about your faith journey and becoming pastors, but obviously a major part of both of your careers has also been your scholarly work and writing. Um, so I guess just to kind of continue with the chronological theme here, um, Paul, how did you first get involved with doing the more scholarly aspects and writing of your career, and was that in tandem with being in a parish setting at that time, or was that a break from being a pastor?
Well, when I graduated from Seminix in 77, 78, somewhere in there, there were no calls because of the schism in the Missouri Synod. And I had been bitten by the philosophy bug in Concordia Senior College in Fort Wayne. So I was an Easterner and I wanted to return from the Midwest to New York City area where I grew up after my two and a half years or whatever it was in St. Louis, finishing the MDiv curriculum. I wanted to go to Seminex to express solidarity with the students um, in protest of the fundamentalist turn of the Missouri Synod. But basically, I wanted to learn the Bible. I wanted to have a good foundation in the Bible. And my plan was to go to the New School for Social Research in Manhattan to get a degree in philosophy. Um, but then I landed in Long Island in a large parish in which the pastor had left days before I arrived in a scandal. And I was suddenly there alone in a 900 member congregation as a vicar, as an intern, and serving them. And in the course of that year, Matthew, I did more than 30 funerals. And that was a pretty impressive experience. It was partly because the funeral director had mercy on me being so poor, and he would pay me $50 for conducting a funeral. But most of these people had no idea of the difference between Jesus and Moses or Jesus and Mohammed. It was just an amazing experience. And it made me get quite serious about maybe I should rather go for theology. And so I applied also to Union Theological Seminary in New York, where I was accepted and came into the program. And I really got a fabulous education there. And um, my pursuit of academic theology was then kind of uh, set in stone for my life.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that summary. Now, remind me of the trajectory here, because so Seminex happens in the 70s, and obviously the ELCA is founded in 87. And I guess you can tell me too if this was the same for everyone. Where did you all end up, the exiled group, denominationally for that decade or so?
Well, when I first went to Union, um, I was in the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches,
So is it
which was the
AELC?
AELC. Yes, that was the remnant of Missouri Synod that left Missouri on the East Coast, especially where I was. And then when I finished at Union, I took a position in the Lutheran Church in America, which at that time had its national headquarters in Manhattan. And I was still living at Union Seminary in Manhattan. And so, uh, as I transitioned into that position in the Department for Church and Society as a researcher, um, I switched my affiliation to the LCA and the Slovak Zion Synod in the LCA. And that's how I became reconnected with my Slovak heritage.
Okay. Yeah, very cool. And then if this comes up later in your story, we can switch to Sarah for a minute. But I guess one other thing I'm interested particularly in talking about in terms of work that you've done is your work with the Journal of Lutheran Ethics, which is, I feel like, sort of a hidden gem of the ELCA that I've discovered more and more the last couple of years. And when did, I guess, how long has that been around, and how long have you been involved with that?
I've been writing for that for years, on and off, because I had this initial formation as a researcher for the Department of Church and Society. Um, and I don't, obviously, I don't have a typical training as a Lutheran ethicist. And I've learned my approach to theological ethics from a variety of sources that I think nuance and reorient Lutheran ethics. So my perspective has been welcomed there. I'm very happy that right now Jennifer Hockenberry is the editor of the Journal of Lutheran Ethics. And she's a good colleague and friend of mine. And um, I have collaborated with her in recent years, writing short pieces for the Journal of Lutheran Ethics.
If I may interject here, Matthew, what you may not know, because you may not have ever had occasion to come across it, but Dad and I share the editorship in the past of the same journal, namely Lutheran Forum. Dad was the editor for 5 years, from I think the late 80s to the early 90s, right, Dad? And I was the editor for nearly 12 years, from 2007 to the end of 2018. And the organization that publishes the journal, which is still around, called the American Lutheran Publicity Bureau, an odd formulation, but it was started in 1918 because, as you might expect, Germans of Lutheran extraction had a very poor reputation in the US in 1918. And they were also abandoning the German language in worship and school en masse and heading toward English. So that was the roots of that organization. But anyway, it's published a journal for a long time, and at a rather significant remove in time, Dad and I were both editors of that journal.
Very cool. Yes. Yeah, I think I've seen at least an article by one of you. That the name of that publication rings a bell. But and you said that's still being published.
That's right. That's right. And all my essays that I wrote for it, I wrote one for every issue for the nearly 12 years. They're on my website if anyone is desirous of plundering those archives.
And for especially the listening audience, but I guess from myself as well, like who is the primary sort of consumer of these journals? Is it mostly like pastors that read these kind of things? Is it lay membership? Is it, because like I say, I think there's a lot of great stuff in there, but I feel like the circulation, at least in a lot of I wasn't aware that there was a Journal of Lutheran Ethics till I went to seminary, kind of thing. And um, uh, I guess I'm just kind of curious, like who who have you gotten a response from when you've written these kind of things?
Matthew, if Sarah, if you'll permit me to go first on
Sure.
this, I want to register a deep concern. It is said that nowadays pastors no longer read theology, that they go through seminary trying to avoid difficult coursework in systematic theology or philosophy of religion, and simply concentrate on practical skills that will make them CEOs of ELCA franchises, I mean congregations. And I think this is a terrible decline. It used to be the pride and joy of Lutheran church tradition that our pastors were the best educated, the most theologically sophisticated. It didn't matter whether you were conservative or liberal in theology. You were well educated and you knew how to pursue theology as the intellectual health of church life. Um, so you ask who reads our articles? Well, I'm sad to say it's a diminishing circle of readership, um, largely because I think seminary education itself has turned away from demanding rigorous training for its pastors. Um, I realize you're at a seminary student right now, and this might not be a very politic thing for me to say, but I have many, many friends in ELCA and Missouri Synod seminaries who would at least privately deeply concur with what I just said.
And now it's my turn to express regrets, which is that the heyday of Lutheran Forum, which started before Dad and was winding down by the end of my editorship, was when Lutherans in America recognized that they had a lot more in common than they did different, namely a confessional tradition and a liturgical devotional tradition that was worth partnering with and ignoring ecclesiastical boundaries. And I think that tracked a great deal with maybe the rise of Lutheranism's prominence and then its massive decline when merger began to be seen as a desirable good. And this is painful to say as someone who worked as a serious ecumenist for many years, but for whatever reason, mergers are not the answer to the problem of church division. They always net more divisions than they eliminate in the first place. And it is my experience now that the ecclesiastical boundaries between Lutherans have never been fiercer or sharper or more mean spirited. And that grieves me greatly because I have good friends who I respect in their Lutheran ministries within the ELCA, where I dwell within the Missouri Synod, within the NALC, the Brethren, other such smaller denominational bodies. And I think it's terribly sad and terribly stupid that we allow uh, bureaucratic and ecclesiastical boundary lines to be more important than our shared confessional convictions.
Okay, a lot of things I can respond to there, but I guess maybe my first question, the historian in me, you mentioned the heyday of Lutherans, and I'm just curious, what would you say the heyday of Lutherans in the United States was or
There's
was?
a
'Cause
historical answer to
I
that
guess
question.
I've never heard of. I mean, obviously there used to be more people in the LCA or whatever, but like, I guess I've never heard of like we've never had a Lutheran president. I've never felt like Lutherans in the United States were that visible. But I guess I'm curious.
Well, there is an factual answer to that question. Franklin Clark Fry, the president of the LCA, was on the cover of Time magazine sometime in the late 50s, um, for an article saying that perhaps the Lutheran Church would emerge in the National Council of Churches to take the leadership of the otherwise decaying mainline Protestant establishment and be the force that would restore sacraments and liturgy to mainline Protestantism and theological seriousness to mainline Protestantism, and also speaking of the LCA, be a reliable way forward to be orthodox in a modern way without succumbing to the temptations of evangelicalism and fundamentalism. That was the heyday. Now, there might have been many other factors behind that heyday, but that was the public perception of the future course of American Lutheranism.
Okay. Yeah, well, you mentioned, first of all, thank you for that. I a word you use there is a word that I've come to use a lot, which uses the word orthodoxy. And I assume you're referring to like neo-orthodoxy was that movement around that time. You had Niebuhr and Barth, and you talked about the issues of fundamentalism kind of within the LCMS at the time that 7X happened, and that I've that sort of neo-orthodox movement of having kind of a confessional core is something that I've become a lot more familiar with the last few years being in seminary. And I know I definitely relate to that in terms of seeing it as a way forward kind of in the various fights kind of within churches or whatever. But I guess, would you like to elaborate any more on how I explain that? And I guess I get the sense from conversations I've heard both of you have that you kind of are in that school of thought as well. But
Just briefly, and I'll turn it over to Sarah. Matthew, as you're a historian, you need to go back to the 1920s and the fundamentalist modernist Christian civil war that took place in
that would have been like the
American.
Scopes monkey trial, and
That's the great symbol of it, right? The fundamentalist modernist schism, and that was what by the 1950s was being perceived as the deep threat to the future of Christianity in the United States. And neo-orthodoxy in the United States, represented by people like Reinhold Niebuhr, and there were several Americans. Dillenberger is one, if my memory is correct. I can't remember his first name, but he was a Lutheran. Um, and then out of that came George Farrell and William Lazarus. These were the great figures coming out of the 50s into the 60s. And they all saw the task of Lutheranism to steer American Christianity between Scylla and Charybdis, between fundamentalism and modernism. Go ahead, Sarah.
Well, and instead we got a fundamentalist church, a modernist church, and then sectarian churches, and those are basically the American religious options anyway. So good job, we just imprinted on our own society. And I mean, honestly, that happens. But I think I would offer two maybe modifications of that, nevertheless, I think more or less accurate depiction, which is one, that the church has, through its whole history, been terribly intoxicated by its own significance. And even though there's a part of me that's proud that there was once a Mr. Lutheran on the cover of Time magazine, and in fact, his son was pastor at Christ Lutheran Church in York, Pennsylvania at one time. So I am connected to that lineage there. The fact is, it's at that point that a lot of Lutheran energy went towards making good use of that significance. And I don't think it's an accident that within less than 20 years, there had been massive internal ruptures that have never, ever healed. When the church starts to look at itself, it stops looking at Christ. It sounds very simplistic, but the pattern tracks through 2,000 years of church history and remarkably different social, cultural, and political significances. But I would also say, and this is a slightly more hopeful corrective to that, which is that historically minded people tend to think in terms of large institutions and their historical significance. And I think if there's any way that I have most dramatically shifted in my theology over the years, it has been an ecclesiological shift to the conviction that God does his principal work at the level of the congregation. This is not to be a congregationalist, because every congregation is connected to every other congregation by the same Jesus Christ. But if you want to look where the work of God is happening, it is not in the national headquarters. It is not in advocacy. It is not in institutional, denominational history. It is in the extremely important and utterly uninteresting to the news work of the Word of God and the sacraments of God and pastoral care and care of the soul that happens at the congregational level. So I can deeply regret many ways in which the history has played out, but I regret it now mainly for the way it has depleted our congregations and pastors to serve them, not because I wish that there was a Lutheran heyday in place still now.
And since I have no fear of there being a Lutheran heyday in the near future, I can largely concur with Sarah's prognosis.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. That was a great summary. I learned some things. Hope the audience learned some things. Um, so you talked about maybe there's not the deep theological tradition within the church is not as deep as it maybe it once was. It's not as out there. Is that one of the things that kind of led you to create your podcast? And even do you just want to talk a little bit about the show that you do, which definitely, from at least my listening, falls into that deep theological tradition?
I think the host should be the first to answer that question.
Well, technically, we are co-hosts, but actually, it started in a much more practical and personal place. We started in, I guess, early 2019, because I had just moved to Japan to be a missionary, and we were, a half a planet apart from each other, and just trying to think of ways to continue our rich and longstanding habit of theological conversation. And I was a little new to podcasting, but I loved it, and I love the medium and wanted to start one, and was racking my brains. Who could I stand to talk to on a regular basis? And Dad was the only answer. Dad had never listened to a podcast when we got going. But all the years I was in Japan, the first 6 years of our podcast, we release an episode every other week. And I joked it was like getting a second PhD, because we cover a lot of ground. We did a lot of preparation, a lot of reading, and would do everything from books of the Bible, both Old and New Testament, to patristic, modern, Reformation theologians, theological topics in the classical sense. Every so often, a relevant item from the culture. Actually, I think in one of our top 10 downloads is the eighth commandment in cancel culture. That one has proved to be quite resilient and relevant over time. Starting last year and then this year, as I've been moving back to the US, and my free time has altered somewhat, as has Dad's taken on new responsibilities. We've dropped back to once a month, but we're still going.
Yes, in fact, Sarah just shared with me that we have now reached and surpassed 150,000 downloads.
Which, for a high octane theology podcast, is pretty good. We're not making any efforts to make it easy for people to follow along with us.
Well, how long have you been doing this podcast?
We're in our 8th year.
8th year. Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
So not Joe Rogan, but not bad for serious theology.
well,
Yeah,
not
and
bad for what one thing I'm learning doing this is just the Lutheran and maybe even the mainline as a whole sort of podcast landscape is ripe for the taking. I was shocked that A Mighty Fortress Is Our Pod was even available. That was, the name that was out there. Which, speaking of which, Queen of the Sciences. Explain that name.
Well, that was the medieval moniker for theology. It was the queen of the sciences. Sciences meaning like areas of scholarship. That's the older sense of the word scientia, from Latin, knowledge. So theology is the greatest of them all, and in the medieval world, queen was the highest designation, not king, when we're talking about knowledge. And at the time, I haven't really looked lately, but the theology podcasting landscape was very jock oriented, definitely, like guys with egos blustering about arcane bits of reformed doctrine, and then whatever topic du jour was getting them all upset. And I thought both as Lutherans, as a father-daughter team, and as being both a male voice and a female voice represented, we were going to give a female designation, Queen of the Sciences, to our podcast. I have to say it was not great for discoverability. I'm sure a lot of people have stumbled on it by accident looking for something entirely different, but oh well.
I think also the only thing I would add to that is that from the very beginning, Matthew, we decided that we wanted to have the podcast never dummy things down, but also patiently try to exposit and explain what we were talking about in a lively way, so that we would be educators and not polemicists or not advocates for some hobby horse, but really take up important topics of theology or the intersection of theology with contemporary society and shed more light than heat.
Hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can say, as someone who's listened to it, yeah, it's definitely one of the richer podcasts that I've listened to. Yeah, content wise, I can tell you do the research, and one of the few podcasts that I can't listen to on double speed. Um, so yeah, if anybody listens to this at double speed, don't feel bad. I do it too. So, yeah, I definitely, it's a lot of good information. So I'm curious. So obviously, it's not like you enjoy making this, and you get to talk about things you're interested in. Have there been any sort of impacts of this podcast that you've seen in terms of uh, people that have gone on to learn more about deeper theology because of this, or just something that you said led to, um, you know, something you did in the congregation or a sermon or whatever, or any of that?
Yeah, we get a steady stream of emails from listeners. We have a Patreon. People pay that they don't have to pay just because they like what we do. We definitely made some friends and connections through it. And I think podcasting is very much sending a message out in the dark and never knowing if it's received. So it's very interesting when you do get a response. I think there's probably more conversations going on than we are directly privy to. And I think one place, to refer back to an earlier topic, I think it was last year or the year before, we did an episode on Seminex on the 50th anniversary, Dad being a graduate, and that story being really poorly known by all American Lutherans now, whether you're Missouri or ELCA or anything else. And so, Dad gave his account of it, and we had hundreds more downloads for that episode than are normal, but we got 0 mail, which leads me to believe there were a lot of people who really wanted to learn about this and didn't have anyone that they could comfortably talk to about it. And I'm inferring that there were quiet conversations or at least reflections that correlate to that greatly increased number. But we didn't get any hate mail, so I don't think it was that kind of listener.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, I would say we never get any hate mail. I've never experienced sometimes some cranky disagreements, but never hate mail.
Well, that's only because Dad insists on being on social media still, and I have the good sense to be off it entirely. That's where the crankitude comes
Yeah,
in.
which I good call there, and that's a whole nother talk about Lutheran ethics and theology. I have all kinds of opinions on social media and what it's doing, and I think one thing that I like about the podcast medium compared to a lot of other online mediums is the long format. We're able to get into more depth, and because
And
I'm
it's
sure.
really hard to hate listen to something for an hour or more, like you can
Yeah, well,
react
and you get the
negatively to a
nuance.
meme. Yeah,
Mhm.
but
And you get the
like, are you really
context.
gonna spend an hour listening to something even at double speed that you really hate? No, you're not. You're gonna move
Mhm.
on to something else.
Yeah, and I wonder if you talk about kind of the decline in deep theology, and I wonder if sort of the hey, everything has to be a 30-second clip, it probably contribute to that as well. I would imagine that.
Sure.
Yeah, kind of how can we reduce all of our everything we believe to a bumper sticker, and
Yeah.
um, yeah, sometimes.
Can I hazard another theory that I think is even precedes the 30-second or Instagram reel approach? I think that what I have seen in the more progressive mainline is a profound abandonment of the idea that there is any good in itself in worship or study or prayer. That all of those things are means to other ends, and the other ends are what is genuinely valued. On the, on the progressive side, that's going to be social action with political results that can be measured, and the story can be presented in the denominational magazine with the right kind of stats or whatever. And I think I'd intuited this for a long time. I didn't have language for it until I read the French philosopher Jacques Ellul, who said that modernity itself is characterized by living eternally in a world of means with no ends ever. Every means is actually just a means to more means, but nothing is ever a good in itself. And I think so much of education, of worship, of pronouncements from synods and national offices is all instrumentalizing God and the Christian faith to some other end, and the other end is always an extrinsic and often secular end, as if the church has lost its conviction that knowing Christ and Him crucified is a good in itself, such a surpassing good that everything else is secondary by comparison to it. And so I think if that's already the deep logic of your ecclesiastical existence, it's no surprise that more and more efficiency down to bumper stickers and memes and 30-second clips are going to be the supreme form of communication, because you always have something more important to do. You have to get on to the next thing. The simply dwelling in the word or worship or prayer are no longer valued. That's what I see to be the kind of deep level disorder.
Rap on, preacher. Rap on.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, and it's kind of hard to know all the cause and effect there, but I guess I do know one of my working theories in terms of like, oh, why is the main line where it's at now is sure, yeah, the heyday may have been 1958 or whatever year he was on the cover of the magazine, but statistically, it seems like the sort of the cliff starts around the turn of the 21st century. And so I do think kind of digital communications and, there's been a lot of talk about just the decline of all kinds of institutions in that time. I assume probably both of you are familiar with like the bowling alone
Yeah.
kind of stuff. Yeah, that um the so yeah, I do think just kind of the loss of those institutional meeting places and the ability to have these longer conversations is
Right.
maybe an underrated element.
Yeah.
So yeah, hopefully these podcasts we can do something. Which I guess maybe before we kind of start to wrap up, the other question I had for you, Sarah, is so you just took a new call. You're a full time pastor, and
Yes.
you're doing this podcast and your other theological work. You write books, things like that on the side. What's the relationship like between those roles?
Well, I'm only 2 months into the new call,
Okay.
so maybe ask me in a year. I have to say one reason why I discerned that this call was the right place for me, where the Lord desired me to be, is because the congregation was as enthusiastic about my scholarship and writing and public speaking as they were about my worship leadership and pastoral care and commitment to this congregation in the city. And I interviewed at a number of churches that were between suspicious and hostile toward a pastor who was also a theologian, which um I regret deeply, but it made me all the gladder to come to Christ Lutheran in New York when I finally got here. So I would say right now I'm still scrambling to find my feet. This is a great congregation, but I'd call it a fixer upper. So I've been doing a lot of fixing in the past 2 months, and I look forward to a more balanced rhythm so I can continue to read. But I'm very committed to ongoing reading and writing because because I said, though I think the congregation is where God does His primary work, every congregation is connected to every other congregation, and what's good for the church at large is good for the local church and vice versa. So I really am very deeply committed to living that out and how I parcel my limited time on this planet in the years to come.
Absolutely. Um, well, definitely. I guess first of all, where can people find both of you and your works? So Queen of the
Well,
Sciences
Dad, you're
podcast.
doing a whole bunch of new things, so I think Dad should have a chance to.
Well, I have a personal website, paulhinlicky.com, which has a record of much of my work and can point you in the right direction. Um, and I would say that I'm very receptive to email. If someone wants to write to me, I'll make my best effort to respond. Um, and I sometimes put stuff up on Facebook, so you can, with my daughter's disapproval and scowl, you can find me there.
Well, but you should also mention Promissio in your new book, Dad.
Oh, well, I mentioned, yeah, I have a new book out called The Apocalypse of God in Christ, A Theology of Theology. I'm editing a big series called Reconstructions in Lutheran Doctrinal Theology from Cascade Press. We have about 25 contracted authors, including my partner in crime, daughter Sarah, who's writing a book on the doctrine of Mary for the series. We've got 4 or 5 books that have come out and 7 or 8 coming out in the next year or so. And so that's a big effort. I'm the editor in chief of that series. And I'm now the editor of a new theological journal called Promissio. That's the Latin word for promise, Promissio. And that's available on the ilt.edu website.
Sarah.
Yeah, and as for me, I also have a personal website, sarahhinlickywilson.com. I also publish books at thornbushpress.com. My 2 most recent books are 40 Facets of the Ascension and 7 Ways of Looking at the Transfiguration, which were both written to solve my own annual preaching problem, but any other preacher who has those difficult festivals come up every year will benefit greatly from my books. So you can find out more about that there. And of course, the podcast, queenofthesciences.com. And also, I am a fiction writer as well, because in addition to having a father, I also have a mother who is the one who trained me in the ways of loving good fiction. And so over at Substack, you can find Sarah Hinlicky Wilson stories. And they are definitely theologically informed stories, but they are definitely fiction, not theology.
Very nice. And then, I said I usually talk about what it means to be Lutheran on here. I think we've covered that fairly well today, but is there anything else either of you would like to add to what you've already said?
There's no way to go back to Luther. You can only go forward with Luther. And so um, we have to look up upon Luther as a resource for the future and not as some icon of a heroic past.
And I guess I would say, when the conscience afflicts you, declare, but I am baptized, and therefore I have the promise that I will be saved, body and soul. I think that line of Luther's never, ever wears out and is a source of ongoing life and hope for everybody.
Baptizatus sum. Yes,
Exactly.
Absolutely. Well, I always like to wrap up with a prayer. So if you would both be willing to pray with me.
please.
God, thank you for this time together to discuss how you've been active in the lives of Sarah and Paul, and just allow us to go forth from this conversation inspired to discover and rediscover the discipline of learning about you through theology. We just pray that you'll continue to raise up leaders and theologians to carry your church forward, and just bless us in wherever we're doing ministry. We pray this in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks for listening to my interview with Sarah Hinlicky Wilson and Paul R. Hinlicky. If you haven't already, you can follow the show on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, and newly available on Substack by going to mightyfortresspod.substack.com, where you can sign up to get an email notification when new episodes come out. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord look upon you with favor and give you peace. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Mighty Fortress Is Our Pod is a production of Mighty Fortress Media. The views and opinions expressed are those of the guests and the host, and are not intended to represent the views and opinions of any Lutheran church body. Be sure to follow this show on Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube. Thanks for listening.